Today we are going to hear two stories, and they're both stories about encountering God, perhaps in unexpected ways. The first one comes from the Old Testament, and it's part of the story of Samuel, a boy who served God in the temple and who hears God calling to him in the night. The other story is one of the many stories that there are in the Gospels about Jesus calling people to be disciples. We're going to hear about two of them in particular, Philip and Nathanael, neither of whom actually feature all that prominently in the rest of the Gospels. After the story that we'll be hearing this morning, Philip is just mentioned a few times, perhaps most notably when he speaks to somebody from Ethiopia and unfolds the scriptures to him. And Nathanael is mentioned just one more time among those who witnessed Christ's crucifixion. But nonetheless, the story of their call is included in the Gospel. And I think that it would be right to say that even though not much else is said about them, they're still quite important people. They're still good disciples. Often, I think, what God most wants is people who just get on with things, who quietly do his work, and who genuinely and sincerely show his love. Each of us is called to place our feet on the risky, challenging, godly path of discipleship. That was certainly Samuel's experience. Jimmy's just read for us a little bit of his story, but I'm sure you will remember how it began with his mother, Hannah, longing for a child, and then, in thankfulness, dedicating him to the service of God in the temple. So Samuel had been living and working in the temple for several years by the time that he had the experience which was related in the story that we've just heard. Up until that point, there had been little, if anything, to suggest that he was destined for great things. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary to happen. And that night, we are told, he mistook the voice of God for the voice of Eli 3 times. Finally, it was the old priest who worked out what was happening and sent Samuel back to listen to God. And the discipleship to which God called young Samuel was risky, and it was challenging. And of course it was also godly. Had we read on in that chapter, we would have heard that the first task that God gave to Samuel was to go and inform Eli, the priest of the temple, of God's displeasure. You see, Eli's sons had been stealing from the offerings and the sacrifices brought by the people to the temple. And Eli had been doing nothing about it. For the boy, this was certainly a testing moment. The first of many testing moments throughout his life of discipleship. And then we turn to the gospel reading. And that reading too was about the call to discipleship. I think discipleship can be one of these kind of buzzwords that churches use rather a lot. But perhaps it's one of these words which is not always so readily understood, like so many jargon words. The story that John tells us, though, I think may be helpful in letting us understand more fully what being a disciple is. And it may also help us to see if what we do and the way that we live our lives make us disciples too. John the Evangelist clearly liked the phrase, the next day. He uses it 3 times in the first chapter. After his famous prologue, the part that begins, "In the beginning was the Word," he starts his story of the life of Jesus with telling us about John the Baptist. Telling us about John the Baptist being questioned by priests who had gone out from Jerusalem to work out just exactly what it was he thought he was doing and why he was doing it. John then says, the next day, Jesus came and was baptized, and John recognized him as the Son of God. And then the next day, John pointed Jesus out to 2 of his disciples, one of whom was Andrew, who then went and brought his brother Simon to meet Jesus. And then the next day is the day of our story today. And as we heard, Jesus decides to go to Galilee. In Galilee, he finds Philip, and he says to him, "Follow me." This seemingly very simple conversation actually reveals a lot when we think about it. It tells us something about Jesus which will be re-emphasized later on in the story. And it picks up on a phrase which John used right at the beginning of his gospel and helps us to understand it. That phrase being, he was the light of all people. In finding Philip, in saying, "Follow me," and in Philip following, we see something of Jesus shining a light on Philip and seeing him for who he really is, a man ready to become a disciple. And we also see Philip realizing that this ordinary-looking man, this Jesus, is in fact extraordinary, is the man to follow. Without any explanation, without any persuasion, without the evidence of a miracle, this is nonetheless a moment of enlightenment. And Philip goes and finds his friend Nathanael to come and share this moment with him. And in a little while, the same thing would happen to Nathanael. The light would shine into him, and he would see the light revealing to him that the man speaking to him was the Son of God. But there are a few steps to go through before that happens. And here things get, I think, a little bit more complicated. It's not difficult, but it helps if we try to attune our ears and hear the echoes that John sets up with the Old Testament. Let's start at the end of the story. In the last verse that we read, Jesus makes the unexpected, the surprising promise to Nathanael, "You will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending. Now, where have we heard something like this before? It's in the story of Jacob, the story of his dream of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, with angels going up and down it. Now, when we think about that story and listen to the words of Jesus to Nathanael, it immediately sets up resonances, and it invites comparisons between the earlier story and the later one. And specifically, I think it invites comparisons between Nathanael and Jacob. You'll remember that Jacob was, well, a bad man in many ways, but he was utterly transformed by coming face to face with God. The reason that Jacob was a bad man was because he was dishonest. There are all sorts of stories in the Old Testament about him deceiving people for his own ends, and some stories, it has to be said, about him being deceived in return. But he has this experience of meeting God face to face, that strange story that we've read a number of times of him wrestling by the river Jabbok. And that night he's transformed. It's the night he's given the new name, Israel. The night when the promise begins to be fulfilled that he will become the father of the Israelite nation, the father of a people who will bear his name for eternity. Now, if we go back to Nathanael, there's no way that we can say he's a bad man. In fact, Jesus specifically says he can see that he's a good man, a man in whom there is no guile, no deceit, no dishonesty. So there's a contrast there with Jacob. But even so, he has this transforming experience, and he has it by coming face to face with God in Jesus. So in a sense, this story casts him as a new Jacob. And we've certainly seen a number of times in recent weeks just how fond the gospel writers were of linking the people that they were writing about to people that their readers would have known about from the Hebrew Scriptures. Nathanael is a kind of everyman, an ordinary person called to faith in Christ, called to be a disciple. I say he's an ordinary person, a good person, like most people, I think. But of course, he's not a perfect person. None of us are. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? He asks. Perhaps it was a joke. But it's a question which I think displays at least the hint of a prejudice in him. But it's also a question which reminds us that Jesus came from an out-of-the-way, unexceptional, unimportant, unimpressive place. But that was the kind of place God chose. And knowing that should help us look for the action of God in places away from the centers of power, away from the limelight, in ordinary places, dare I say it, like our place, like Dalkeith. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, Philip simply answers, come and see. Come and see for yourself if you think that I'm right about who this Jesus really is. Come and see if something good has come out of Nazareth. And Nathanael comes with his friend Philip. And a brief conversation takes place between Jesus and Nathanael. And again, we see this ability of Jesus to shine a light and to reveal a person's true nature. And again, we see a person's response to encountering the light of Christ. Where did you get to know me? Nathanael asks. Jesus says something about seeing him under a fig tree, but the real answer is that he has always known Nathanael. And he's always known him because he is God. And God knows us all. And because Jesus is God incarnate, because Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, he desires to be in a relationship with Nathanael, as he desires to be in a relationship with us all. And it is that realization which leads Nathanael, the man in whom there is no deceit, to make this confession. Looking at Jesus, he says, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And he becomes a disciple, a follower. So from these two stories, what have we learned about becoming a disciple? Well, from Samuel, we've learned that we don't have to be obviously special to be called by God. Also from Samuel, we've learned that we can miss the signs that we are being called by God, but God will still call us until we get it. And we've learned that sometimes it's someone else who understands first and who says to us, "I think God is calling you." Then from Philip, we've learnt that the call to discipleship can be very simple. All he heard was, "Follow me." We've seen the call coming through an encounter with Christ. And we've recalled that Andrew was called in very much the same kind of way. But then both Philip and Andrew have gone to tell someone that they knew and cared about, Andrew's brother Simon, Philip's friend Nathanael. And that shows us that we can be called through others. And that discipleship is, in part, a matter of disciples calling others to Christ, to come and see what I have found. And the good thing is that we can call others very simply. It doesn't require great gifts of eloquence. It doesn't require us to be able to prove anything through extensive arguments. It just requires us to be honest and to be authentic with our words and our lives. And then from Nathaniel, we've learnt that the call to discipleship is really about our lives being transformed, about us being called from the old thinking and the old ways to new thinking, to new ways, to deeper loving. And we've also seen that we are called to be Christ's disciples because Christ already knows us and already loves us and wants us to know him. And finally, we've caught a glimpse of something beyond this life and this world. We have learnt that the call to discipleship includes the promise to see heaven opened, to see justice roll down like rivers, to be bathed in the light of God's truth, to be filled with the wisdom of God's Spirit, and to be caught up by the grace of Christ and carried forever into the heart of the divine. Amen.